Hello everybody and welcome to NQA's webinar on the migration of 18001 to ISO 45001. My name is Terry Fisher. I'm the Principal Assessor here at NQA. So welcome to the webinar. Just to give you a little bit of an oversight about NQA, we are a global presence in certification. We have global coverage for numerous standards, obviously including 9, 14,000, 45,000 and various others, 27,001, etc. So whatever your needs, we should be able to accommodate you should you have any additional needs for certification or expansion to your existing schemes. We also have a trusted customer base and client base. We're delivering over 43,000 standards certificates globally, operating in over 90 countries, and all our fees are all inclusive. Certainly within the UK, they're inclusive of all travel within the UK. For clients, there's no additional charges, etc., etc. So it's if you are looking to expand, etc., then obviously NQA could be your first port of call as a one-stop shop for all your requirements. There's some information about NQA and its service to its clients. As I say, transparent charging. We don't charge travel expenses within the UK. There's no hidden costs or certification fees, etc. So if anybody needs any further information, we may have a problem with sound. One of our registered listeners can't hear. I can confirm that my microphone is unmuted. And the screen and display and everything should be fully visible to you. Other people can hear me, so it may be a problem at individuals' end. There's various other attendees that have confirmed that they can hear, and it appears all good. So there's NQA's price promise. So before we get into the actual presentation itself, anyone who has any questions, by all means type them in as we go. I'll either answer questions as we go, depending on the type of question, or I'll save some up towards the end if we get several questions of a similar ilk. It's obviously an open forum. If you've got any questions, I'd just like to clarify that I can't answer individual organisational queries. I can only answer questions relating to the standard and the assessment process generically. I can't give specific answers to an individual's company's concern. That would be regarded as consulting, and also it would be difficult for me not being in that organisation or seeing what's actually going on, so it's difficult to make a judgment. So just so we've clarified that going forward. So why implement ISO 45001 in an occupational health and safety management system? The first thing is to enhance and improve performance, to help deliver risk-based thinking and worker engagement, and develop a positive culture change within organisations. It's proactive risk management, it's a systematic approach, it can help reduce culpability, and it certainly should lead to added protection for workers and the organisation. It can help demonstrate a proven commitment in both leadership, action, and improvements in performance and engagement. As most of you will be aware, ISO 45001 is a completely new ISO standard. OHSAS 18001 was not an ISO standard, although it was internationally recognised. It isn't an ISO standard, and therefore the introduction of ISO 45001 is significant in terms of it enables the enhancement of integration of management systems to existing ISO management system standards using the Annex SL structure. This will be familiar with clients who use 9001 2015 and 14001 2015 and 27001 recently revised, etc. So this revised structure has been applied to ISO 45001 and can help its integration within an organisation, which, if you've got 18001, can be also a reduction in administration and burden, as the alignment to the existing management system structure really does centralise and integrate the common components across the various disciplines of ISO management systems. Annex SL as a structure, although it has 10 elements, the first 3 elements are in reference to the standard itself. So it talks about the scope of the standard, what it's trying to achieve, the normative references within the standard, and terms and definitions. The terms and definitions is quite a useful element when you're looking at implementation, etc. There's various terms and stuff in there that have been revised, documented information, etc., etc. And it can be very helpful to review those terms and definitions in that as you're reading through the standard requirements and implementing it and making going through the migration process. The actual auditable bits of the standard structure is basically elements 4 to 10 inclusive. So these are the things that we as assessors will come to organisations and assess. And as we've previously said, this is the same structure that's applied to 9, 14, 27,000, etc. So it helps that integration, it helps that cultural integration of the standards being integrated into the company or the organisation's corporate structure and corporate culture, rather than being, oh, we've got to look at everything separately. So it's very much about integration and making it a real live management standard that's applicable to the organisation and means something in the day-to-day, not just 2 or 3 days before the assessor arrives. So as demonstrated there on the slide, the context of the organisation is looking at what the organisation is, etc. We'll go through these in a little more detail throughout the presentation. Leadership, planning, support, operations, performance evaluation, and continual improvement. So in terms of those sections, if we briefly summarise section 4, context of the organisation. For those of you not familiar with the term, it's basically requiring the organisation to consider and look at what does it do, why does it do it, who's interested in it, why are they interested, are those needs of those interested parties met, how are they delivered, how do they know they were effectively delivered, and basically what pulls and pushes an organisation to be what it is. So it's a way of standing back from the organisation and considering why do we do this, what are we trying to achieve, what are the benefits of doing that. And this, in terms of occupational health and safety, is a critical path. You really do need to think about what's the benefit, what am I trying to achieve by doing this activity or putting this control in place, and then confirming as the system develops, you know, did it work, was it effective, did it deliver the benefit? Without stepping back and understanding that context of the organisation and the interested parties, then the rest of it is very difficult to achieve. So section 4, looking at that context and those interested parties, is really critical. The primary interested party within the OHS management system structure are workers. Obviously, they're the core group that the system's trying to protect. So they're the primary interested party. And the term workers is deliberately used rather than staff or employees, because the workers could also include external contractors, supply service providers, etc., etc. So it's looking at the activities overall that impact on the occupational well-being of workers. That's a really key point. The other interested parties could include regulators, regulatory requirements, commercial considerations, etc., etc. All these things are being considered as a general element of running a business. In section 5, it looks at leadership. So it looks at the strategy of the organisation. What does it want to be? What does it want to achieve? Which direction is it going in? Is it expanding? Is it going into new areas of activity? Is it reducing? Is it going into new markets? Is it developing new technology for existing markets, etc.? And all these things need to be considered as part and linked to the context, because as the organisation moves forward and tries to deliver its strategy and its policies, then things no doubt will have to change. These things get revised, roles, policies, responsibilities, and to make all those things develop effectively, you need participation and worker engagement at all levels. So that's a very brief overview of section 5 and the leadership. Section 6 is looking at hazard and hazard identification, risks and opportunities, which also link into, so the risks and opportunities also link into the context of the organisation. What are the threats and the opportunities that are driving the organisation? Why is it strategically going to do this or that or the other? Then there can be commercial risks and opportunities, but they then influence the hazard identification and the risks and opportunities that the workers and the organisation face both internally and externally, depending on its activities. So it's really about linking these elements together. They're not just done in isolation. Yes, they need to be considered in isolation initially so that you can understand what you're trying to achieve. But overall, it's a management system, and it's about the connectivity between the various component parts of the system, which overall give it its effectiveness. In there, in section 6, is also looking at compliance obligations and objectives and plans to achieve them. Compliance objectives are nothing new, or legal and other requirements, depending on whatever terminology you want to use. The standard in this particular case for 45001 uses legal and other requirements, but it could also have compliance obligations. It may choose as an organisation to adhere to something that isn't a statutory obligation. So that would come under the other requirements under the compliance obligations. But once those compliance obligations are established, they all have an equal footing and equal influence on the organisation, or should have. A statutory requirement, yes, it's a mandatory thing, but also the same emphasis and resource, etc., needs to be put into other compliance obligations that the organisation subscribe to. So if it says it wants to do something because it's chosen to do that for commercial considerations or whatever, they should all be given equal weight and commitment in terms of leadership and resource. Within section 7, you've got areas of resources, so things, you need to achieve various things, you need to protect people, so you'll need some resources. There needs to be commitment to that. The resources need to be identified, they need to be suitable. You have to look at competence of operations and operators. The awareness of people, so they understand what is required of them in terms of roles, responsibilities, the actual operational controls, the hazards, the risks, and the various things within the operation. That communication needs to be defined and considered and documented and supported with information. And documented information is a revised term within Annex SL. So certainly in terms of health and safety, it's not only the traditional hard copy information that traditionally is seen, it's also verbal communication. It can be that's documented in various ways, so it could be a text, an email, or whatever. It could also be in terms of software that can impact on the operational control. A lot of operations may well be software or electronically system driven, so therefore it's actually the software version that's actually giving the operational control that prevents various things happening at the same time or reduces risk by that level of control. So it can be a major consideration in terms of operational control for software and various things in terms of occupational health and safety. It needs to be controlled in the traditional way. It needs to be, controlled in version, type, etc. But it does include like software, electronic media, all the various formats now that are now available to organisations at various levels. So it's for you to define those requirements and control them appropriately to give the overall benefit of worker protection. In operational control, there is the hierarchy of control and looking at change management and procurement. Procurement is a key control process, especially when it comes to control of contractors and external services, etc., and ensuring they've got the right competencies, what they're going to do, they understand. So it's that integration and that communication between what's required by the organisation, the service provider, the contractor, what's the expectation, has it been checked, does everybody understand what the risks, the opportunities are, is it suitably resourced, etc. So procurement is a strong element within 45001 going forward. And then obviously, in addition to there's normal operational control, you've then got emergency preparedness. In the normal way, looking at abnormal and emergency situations and various things, and having suitable resource in place and plans in place that have been checked to ensure they work. Don't wait for an emergency to happen to ensure that your evacuation procedure works. You need to do trial tests, etc., in the traditional way. So it's very much common sense applied within occupational health and safety. It's about risk-based approach, so it's the control should be appropriate to the risks and the hazards, etc. So when we talk about risk and opportunity, it isn't just talking about the traditional risk assessment methodology, it's talking about applying that to the management system in terms of based on its significance. So that's one of the reasons why you do risk assessments. But it can also apply to commercial risk, it can also apply, etc., throughout the organisation in all sorts of considerations. Then in section 9 and 10, we've got the usual things there: internal audit, management review, and also under the evaluation and improvement elements of section 9, we've also got evaluation of compliance. That is deliberately kept separate to compliance obligations, statute, legal and other. It's because if you've got these compliance obligations, which most organisations have, then in section 9, you're required to confirm that all your controls and your various activities are delivering that compliance. Don't just assume that because you understand what the compliance is and you've got loads of procedures and controls in place, that actually it's delivering it. So that is an important element to statutory and compliance obligations generally. It's actually confirming by some methodology how that's actually being delivered, and it's being delivered effectively. You can't just assume that because you've got 10 procedures that that compliance obligation is being delivered. You have to actually check the effectiveness of that delivery. Performance evaluation in the normal way, improvement and objectives, incident information and corrective action, so non-conformance, etc., incident requirements, all those things are all managed in a very similar way across all the disciplines. Obviously, when it comes to OHS performance, there needs to be investigation, looking at root cause, there needs to be participation of others, etc. So it's looking at the effectiveness of lessons learned, risk reduction, and applying that risk reduction going forward, and also enhancements and taking advantage of the various communications that can come out of these reviews and investigations in terms of how can we do things better, how can we stop that hazard impacting on us in the future. And obviously then the improvement process also links to things like objectives and targets and various things of that nature. So it isn't just the direct corrective actions in relation to incidents. And remember, within occupational health and safety, we're not just talking about incidents in terms of physical injury. We're also talking about mental health and well-being of the workers overall. So it isn't just about broken bones and cut fingers, etc. So that's a very quick overview of what we're going to cover. So the starting point when you're looking at the management system is to think about the context, the strategic direction and the leadership, the needs and requirements of the interested parties. And as I say, workers are the primary interested party in that, but there are obviously others. And when you look at all these things together, what the organisation does, where it wants to be, where the leadership want to take the organisation going forward, the needs of the workers and other interested parties identified within that, then only then can you look and define the scope of the management system as applies to that particular organisation. And the scope itself then needs to be documented. So if we think about that in terms of the context, if we think about different types of organisations, a water company, a public limited company, may well have a very different context to a university, which is obviously an educational establishment. And again, that could be very different to a food manufacturer, a limited company, mid to large scale, let's assume. Obviously very different to the other two. The needs and requirements, there may be some similarities, but what that organisation does and how it tries to achieve it is very different. And all these things need to be considered. Down to small engineering companies or small enterprises, the principles of what they're trying to do in the management system need to be applied in exactly the same way. Obviously, the scale has an impact on its resources or the structure and the roles and responsibilities and the various things and the needs and requirements to some extent of group or different levels within an organization. But this management system can be applied to smaller organizations equally effectively, and we often see very effective delivery of these management systems within SMEs, for example. So the context, looking at the terms of the actual clauses of the standard, understanding the organisation, its context, what does the organisation do, understanding the needs and expectation of workers and other interested parties. When those two things are understood, then only then can you then determine the scope. And then there's some general requirements about the management system generally within section 4 of the standard. This is very new. This wasn't part of 18,001, and this is one of the major new elements that's been considered. But it would have existed in practice within 18,001. The principles of what this is looking at, it's the linking and the connectivity between the organisation, its needs and interested parties into its operations. It's called context in the standard. However, it will no doubt have been considered in 18, but not in a formal way. So when we're doing assessments, we have to formally assess the context, and this is why we need to speak to leaders within an organisation, etc., to help us understand the context and its leadership and direction. There are various models that organisations use, pestle analysis, various S models for shared values and system and skills and staff and all the various things. The standard doesn't dictate the model that needs to be used or doesn't dictate how you achieve this, but you must be able to demonstrate the consideration of this when the assessor looks at your management system. So here are some examples of interested parties, potentially how they compare across potentially different management system considerations and disciplines. So, you've got customers. Customers appear in all of them, but they may have a higher significance depending on the discipline, and it depends on the context of, pardon the pun, the context of the organisation, what it does. But you can see there's quite a lot of similarities in terms of regulators and workers and managers and customers and visitors and members of the public, etc. The scope of the management system is required to be documented. It needs to define the boundaries and applicability of the management system as far as that organisation is concerned. That then takes us into leadership. So in section 5 of the standard, there are elements of this in 18, but these are defined structures within 45. And it can't be emphasized enough that leadership play a really significant role in the performance and operational performance and culture of an organization. They use the word leadership is a deliberate change in terminology. It isn't just about management. In leadership, you're trying to enhance participation with workers and interested parties to provide that safe and healthy working conditions. And as I say, it's about that level of commitment. And leadership is also at a lot of different levels within different organisations. So yes, we need to speak to the senior leadership of a certain organisation when we're doing the assessments, but we also need to speak to other leaders at various levels, team leaders, supervisors, charge hands, whatever the title be within different organisations. They all contribute to the effectiveness of the overall management system, and it's important that they all understand their roles and know their requirements. And it's about commitment to that at all levels, not just a few words in the policy, but it needs to cascade down into operational effectiveness and to deliver that benefit of protection and risk reduction. And also, as we said, it's not just about the physical accidents, it's also about the mental well-being of workers within an organisation. The leadership clause goes into organisational roles and responsibilities. The phrase accountabilities has been dropped from the title. It's because you can't change accountability. The senior leaders within an organisation are held accountable ultimately for the performance of that organisation. So organisational roles, responsibilities and authorities is still there, and that needs to be understood. There needs to be documented information to support those, so that can be numerous things, job descriptions, organisations charts, etc., etc. And consultation and participation at work is a really key element of the management system overall. The standard 45001 talks about mechanisms and removal of barriers. So it's about culture change, not just, oh, we've made these rules and regulations. It's about a culture of openness so people feel empowered, encouraged to participate, not frightened to say, I don't understand that, I don't want to do that because I think it's unsafe, etc. It's about the culture overall of that organisation. And it can take a long time to grow into a positive culture for OHS and the workers generally. But this is the ultimate aim of the management standard, and it's really important that workers feel that they are part and empowered to participate within the management system. It isn't just something that's done to them as part of the operation. So it needs time and resources, information, communication and training, non-manager participation to identify hazards and controls, and the establishment of the system, including the policy. So workers at various levels can be included in the establishment of the policy, and it should be encouraged throughout. It's trying to engage the various elements of an organisation within the whole of the management system, not just, oh, you're only interested in your particular bit of the operation. I'm just quickly whizzing through. A question here has come up about how soon do you believe ISO will integrate 9001, 14001 into one common standard? I'm not necessarily convinced they will in the fullness of time, and this is purely my own personal opinion. I think the structure that's being applied now, I think they could have sold the structure a little better, in so much as if we say Annex SL as a structure is a very adaptable and appropriate structure for various disciplines, then I think it should have been promoted more as we've got a module for quality, we've got a module for environment, we've got a module for occupational health and safety, we've got a module for information security, etc. So I think the framework and structure of the standards as it's been developed with Annex SL is quite a strong structure and flexible structure to move forward with. I'm not necessarily convinced that they will bring a unifying standard to incorporate all three, because it may not be appropriate or a requirement for particular organisations to do everything at the same level or whatever. So, and at the end of the day, it's about delivering organisational benefit to the clients, not just about writing the standard. It's got to mean something to the organisation, and it's got to be effectively delivering the benefit that it's intended. So I personally don't perceive it as being necessarily a priority to have a single common standard. In terms of section 6, looking at hazards and risk reduction, so this is traditionally looking at hazards, risk reduction, risk assessment methodology, etc. All those various things, and then implementing a hierarchy of control within that. Obviously, the hierarchy of control is used as a measure of effectiveness, the most effective being the widest thing at the top of the hierarchy, and then slowly dropping down to the least effective, going down into administrative controls and PPE. I think that's well understood. Certainly within the UK, I think most organisations, I think it can get overlooked when people are looking at risks and opportunities. Certainly in terms of noise and occupational exposure, etc., etc. I think this hierarchy gets overlooked. People immediately have a tendency to jump straight into administrative controls and PPE for those types of things, because it isn't necessarily an easy thing or a quick thing to eliminate the noise or whatever from the environment in the workplace. So I think sometimes it does get overlooked, but it should be built into the structure of the consideration and the processes to look at elimination as the primary, most effective element of the control process. Planning is also about successfully achieving outcomes and objectives to address risks and opportunities and to meet its legal compliance obligations. So not only its current ones, but it may be something that's planned for the future or whatever in terms of both legislation or strategic requirements for the organisation. In section 6, we've got the planning clauses, actions to address risk and opportunities, so it's hazard identification, assessment of risk and opportunities, and shall be maintained as documented information again, both in, so that can be electronic and or hard copied format. Determination of legal and other requirements. Obviously, to comply with them, you firstly need to know what they are, and you also need to understand how they apply to your particular organisation. And then, as I say, that then links into section 9, which is then the compliance evaluation process. Planning to take action in terms of risk reduction, etc. Setting objectives and detailing plans of how to achieve them. And that in itself is an addition in terms of 18,001. The 18,001 didn't require the planning, the actual documentation of the actions and the various things, how you're going to get from A to B to achieve your objective. Whereas this is more, it gives a good rounded overview what steps a management system needs to take, and therefore you need to identify how you're going to achieve that how you're going to reduce that risk, what you're going to do, and also to assess the risks prior to implementing any change. So it's really important. We often see organisations make a change for the best potential reasons to achieve an objective, but actually they haven't considered the implications of making that change, and it can introduce not necessarily a higher level of risk, but it can introduce new or different risks by making that change, and they need to be considered as part of that planning and management of change process. What you don't want to do is make a change and then it introduces something that risks that are then out of control and deliver risk and injuries to operators and to staff and to people generally that weren't considered. It's better to be preventive, and that's the whole structure of the management system overall. It's perceived as a preventative management system, not as a reactive management system. It obviously works on the same model as the other management standards in Plan, Do, Check, Act principles, and certainly within the UK, that's been a widely emphasised model for a number of years. And the risk assessment is one of the primary steps and one of the primary drivers for that Plan, Do, Check, Act process. Because if you don't know what the risks are, how are you going to identify, how you're going to address the controls and identify any risk reduction going forward. So it looks at that model there. Section 7 is centred on communication and the leadership and the resources, information necessary, maintenance and cooperation and improvement of the management system overall. It sounds really common sense, but competence and communication and awareness, these are cultural things that the organisation needs to deliver, as well as the practical things. So it isn't just the resources. People need training, information, etc., and support in achieving what is a safe system of work for the required activity. So it looks at the resources, the information and the training, all to give a rounded support and an effective management system overall. Within the actual clauses of the standard, it looks at competence. A note there, it applies to external workers and contractors. And it links to procedures as well as staff, obviously internal staff and operators. We need to see documented information to support that competence. So records, training records, evaluations, etc., training plans. Awareness, including workers' ability to remove themselves from situations of imminent and serious threat to life. So people need to understand culturally that it's encouraged that they remove themselves from that if that situation arises within their occupational activities or whatever. They shouldn't feel threatened, and as I say, it's coming back to the culture of the organisation. And communication, the clause has been expanded in terms of 18,001 to include internal and external communication. Why does it communicate? What does it communicate on? Who's going to do it, etc. What's that trying to achieve? Did it achieve it? All these things need to be considered and demonstrated within the organisation's assessment and within its management system. And as we've said before, documented information in terms of a range of media, not just hard copy, and it must be suitably controlled in whatever format it takes. The operations, obviously this is the fundamental, this is the reality, what it means in the operations, what actually goes on within an organisation, what actually happens, and not just during the day when you might have leadership support and various supervisory roles actively engaged in the operation, but also at other times, weekends, during the night, etc., where that support level may not be at the same rate. The culture of an organisation may change significantly, doing the same operation over the night, etc. So it can be important to consider, is that resource there? Do they have this? Does that work? Is the expectation the same? Is the performance the same? Organisations have a great amount of data that can use to indicate the effectiveness of a management system, and it won't necessarily be direct health and safety data per se about incident performance or whatever. It could be about operational performance, and you should be using all this information to indicate the effectiveness of the operation and the various things. Operational control, including maintaining documented information and adapting work to workers. So looking at the ergonomics and the principles of that. Wants to be looking at the elimination of hazards and reducing occupational health and safety risks. The management of change, as we touched on earlier, a key element. Procurement, as I say, in section 8, now includes general requirements for procurement, but also contractors and outsourcing, etc., as part of those requirements. And emergency preparedness and response hasn't been significantly enhanced. I think most people understand what we're talking about when we look at emergency preparedness, but it can be applicable to particular organisations and their activities, so it can be unique to them. Performance evaluation. Obviously, having carried out all the activities in Clause 8, we need to understand that they're being effectively and safely delivered. So monitoring and measurement of analysis and performance. Information. Once you touch on information within organisations, there's generally a wealth of indicators there, and a lot of organisations do a lot of monitoring and measurement. Whether they use it as effectively as they could as indicators for OHS performance is there for the assessment to establish, but there's generally quite a bit of documented information supporting various things, and it may not always be direct, it can be indirect, so it's worth thinking what your data and your information is actually telling you, other than just there's been an increase in production, or actually the production rate decreases on the night shift or whatever, depending on whatever your particular organisation and its needs. So you can use a lot of that information as indicators and as monitoring information, as well as inspections and audits and formal activities going on, looking at monitoring and measurement. Internal audits is obviously retained there as part of the system requirements. The internal program needs to be internal audit program needs to be retained as documented information. You need to then deliver that in the planned way, and also think about risks and use a risk-based approach to the internal audit program. If your performance is indicating you've got a particular area of concern or whatever, then it's quite logical to use your internal audit program to look at that more frequently. That's something that indicates it's a lower risk. So use risk-based approach within your internal audit programming, and review it on a regular basis, because things change. Things can change mid-year or whatever. It doesn't always fit to your program schedule. So don't be frightened of changing your audit program if there's something comes up that's different. It's about delivering the benefit of internal auditing and inspections and various things, not just about, oh, well, we only do that in January because. So it's about applying what you already know about your own organisations to internal audits and getting them to be as effective as possible to assist the management system effectiveness overall. Management review. There's been some changes in management review, wording primarily, but no significant changes to the structure of management review. It's an important activity. Management review shouldn't be confused with just operational review. Management review is looking at the system's performance overall and the requirements thereof. One of the fundamental objectives of the management system is to improve performance over time, so hence the continual improvement process. And that can be partially achieved by reviewing incidents and non-conformity and corrective action, doing accident investigations, all the various things there that are needed within the management system. The key points to bear in mind if you're starting from scratch, introducing 45001, have available to you the standard. It may seem an obvious thing to say, but you shouldn't be surprised. There is a number of clients and organisations that go down this road and they don't have access to the standard requirements. It really is important for you as clients to understand what you're trying to achieve. Yes, we can support your activities with gap guides and various things like that, but as part of that commitment, it really is important that you understand the standard and its requirements. That said, NQA themselves don't sell standards, or you can't get standards directly from us. I would suggest you go via ISO, and if you need to acquire a copy, then ISO is the first port of call to look. If you're starting from scratch, look at your legal compliance and sources of legal compliance information and other requirements that may be applicable. That can be easily said. It can be quite a demanding thing to look at the legal compliance because they're not necessarily written in a straightforward way that it's easy to establish, oh, does that apply to our organisation? One of the things to maybe consider there is look at your existing arrangements, and use some reverse logic and sort of say, well, we do that because there's a statutory obligation. We know that. That's a good starting point. If you collect all that information up as a starting point, it's a good foundation on which to build. But then you also need to consider how to keep that up to date and keep it refreshed and applicable to your particular organisation in the changing legislative framework or other structural framework that may apply to your particular organisation. Review your existing arrangements for hazards and risk assessment. Conduct a gap analysis to help identify the improvement points between 18,001, from your existing system and the implementation of 45,001 if you're starting from scratch. NQA can support you in this, so we can come and provide this service at a cost. And a lot of organisations do feel that is really beneficial because it helps them clarify what the standard is looking for as they move forward. Complete some system internal audits. Conduct the management review as required within the revised standard of 45,001. And then look at, for your registration process, the initial assessments of stage 1 and stage 2. That's a very brief overview of if you were starting from scratch. And if you're an existing OHSAS 18001 client, obviously read the standard of 45,001. Consider either an internal or an external gap analysis. As before, NQA can help you do that migration gap analysis. And we also support our existing clients with some documentation in terms of that. Complete system internal audits against the new requirements to ensure that what you think is effectively being delivered is actually being delivered. Conduct a management review and confirm date for migration of your certification. at the relevant point within as required by you. As I say, NQA do provide guidance documents, both generally available for its website and also some directly and specifically available to its clients. Certainly a migration gap analysis is available to our existing clients who have 18001 and are looking to migrate. Just a quick reminder, as we look at the migration process, 45001 was published in 2018 in March. So already we are halfway through approximately the migration period. So you've got until March 2021 to migrate your existing 18001 system. After March 2021, 18001 will no longer be recognised. ISO 45001 is a direct and overriding replacement for 18. So I'm going to run through some question and answers that have been sent in. This question is, do you feel a website about us or whatever would provide enough evidence of the context? No, not really. Certainly not. We'd need to understand, when we talk about evidence, we also take evidence verbally. So there's a requirement within 45001 to have leadership interviews, etc. So I would say a website may provide some information, but it wouldn't provide enough necessarily purely to meet the requirements of the context elements. Just a reminder that all of you have registered. We will be sending the slides out to all of you. And if there have been any problems with sound, etc., it has been recorded so you can re-listen to it at a later date at your convenience. But you will also receive the slides to everyone that's been registered. Question here. If you have 9 and 14, the only extras you'll need to focus on is more engagement consultation. I wouldn't agree with that either. Occupational health and safety systems are looking at protection of people. So there's a whole range of incident investigation and various things there that are relevant and applicable. Hence why there are different management standards for those various disciplines. It isn't just an extension to looking at more worker engagement and participation. So it does bring its own requirements as a module within the Annex SL framework. Just been asked about the presentation. As I've just confirmed, it will be sent out to all of you that's registered. So that's that question. Question here, how would you determine the adequate level of worker participation in defining the procedures? There can be numerous examples of that, in fairness. It could be documenting the participation of workers in the assessment process, in the hazard and the improvement process, in a sign-off and whatever of the training and implementation of control procedures or revisions, etc. There's numerous ways of demonstrating worker engagement and participation in the management system, its processes and requirements. Asked here about the cost of certification to respective standards based on the same frameworks. I can turn around and say that certainly within the under the UCAS requirements and the international requirements, there can be some savings made across system integration because they are all using a similar structure. But obviously each discipline has its own requirements within that structure. So they're not identical per se. They have the same, shall I say, chapter headings within the requirements. And people that are looking to add multiple standards of the Annex SL management system framework, then you can expect, once it's been confirmed that those systems are fully integrated, etc., there is a reduction of 20% across certification time allowance for that connectivity across the various modules. But the costing of assessment and certification is dependent on each individual organisation, its size, its activity, and it's governed by UCAS and international guidelines in terms of time allocation and resources required in terms of a certification and assessment. So it's not just, NQA's version of, we are working to internationally recognised and UCAS accredited guidelines in determining the time and allocation as appropriate. It must be said, anybody migrating from 18,001, talking about the time for assessments, etc., there is a mandatory requirement that's required internationally, which isn't defined in 45,001 per se. It's in the higher level documentation and structures of UCAS and the ISO IAF implementation program, that as a minimum, an addition of 1 day will be added to your existing recertification time if you're an 18,001 client. That's to cover in-depth things like context and leadership, and the requirement for worker interviews and worker requirements to attend closing meetings and various mandatory attendance at closing meetings, which is now been implemented across all OHS management systems, including 18,001. So anybody existing having visits for 18,001, it's a mandatory requirement that and people have to be available at the closing meeting. It must be attended by senior management responsible for the system, occupational health and safety responsibilities, and workers representatives with responsibilities for OH&S. So they must all attend as a mandatory item, the closing meetings of any existing either 18,001 or 45 assessment visits. The next question is, how long in your opinion would it take for an SME to implement 45,001? I really can't answer that directly, because it would depend on what the SME itself has got already in place, its level of commitment, its level of resource availability, etc., etc. So it really is an independent company by company or organisation by organisation assessment. It can be achieved quite quickly if somebody's already got a very strong OHS culture and systematic approach, and it really is about the individual organisation. But if you need a quote or an estimation of the allocation of time based on your type of requirements, by all means contact NQA. We'll be happy to give you a no obligation quote, so it gives you an indicative allocation of time and costs, etc. appropriate. Next question is, how management change could be accelerated if I think as with most things, if the management commitment is really strong in terms of implementing this, then if that's a real focus for that management organisation, then it can be done really effectively and really well. You get out of these systems what you put in, and if there's a high level of commitment and they want to do it really effectively, don't confuse speed of implementation with effectiveness. Some organisations dash in to, oh, we want, we want to be the first, or we want to be the first in the group or whatever, actually think about what you're trying to deliver in terms of implementation of the management system. The next question, what is the most different requirements? All the requirements of 18,001 have been enhanced in 45,001, and the most significant of those is obviously the context of the organisation, the leadership commitment, the worker engagement, and there's various other enhancements throughout. So it needs to be taken in the round. The 45,001 is a very effective, well-written management standard in my view, and it can be very helpful to organisations that have already got other management system requirements. So it shouldn't be seen as an add-on. It should be, this is the way this organisation does business, does what it does, not, oh, well, we make blue widgets and we also try and do it safely. So it does require it to be integrated into the normal operations of the organisation. Somebody's asked, where is a good example of a gap analysis process for organisations? For NQA clients, we have a gap analysis document that we provide to them. There is some guidance on gap analysis. Yes, and we can provide that service at a cost, but what I would turn around and say, to some extent, the standard itself, if you use the content of the standard and then gap your own operations against that, can be a very useful and systematic way of developing a gap analysis document for you that's very useful. There's a question here about a particular standard in Indonesia. And the question is ISO 45001, can it accept the implementation of these requirements? If they effectively deliver the requirements of 45001, then how you do it, why you do it, how it works for you, as long as it's effective, then, and it meets the requirements of 45001, yes, it could be equally credible. It's about the effectiveness of that performance delivery, which is the key requirement. Question here, would something like a signed signature sheet be the best way to record worker participation? It can be in particular circumstances. It isn't always. It could be meeting minutes, it could be signed sheets, it could be records of risk assessment. There's a whole myriad of ways of demonstrating worker participation, and they're all equally valid depending on what you're trying to achieve and what that activity is actually doing. So it's about, yet again, that effectiveness of process that's the key. Question here on welfare and within OHS. Welfare, and as with all the standards of occupational health and safety, welfare is a key consideration, and that needs to be appropriate. In the UK, we've got quite a strong legislative framework governing that, as we have also looking at communication and things. But welfare and worker well-being and resources, etc., it's about the appropriateness, and it's really important that the organisation understands what the workers need, to perform effectively in the activities and to keep them safe and well. So you do need to, the provision of welfare, there's some mandatory requirements there. All these things, certainly within the UK, there's mandatory compliance requirements for them. But in other geographical locations, it's about the organisation considering both what it has to do and what it may want to do. A lot of organisations go above and beyond the legal minimum standard, both in the UK and internationally, because it's the right thing to do and it encourages good worker relationships. So welfare and all resource provision is really important for the general well-being. So I think that's the overall summary of the questions that were asked. I hope we've delivered some benefit in terms of your awareness and your understanding of the migration between 18 and 45, or the implementation of 45,001. Should you need any more further guidance or support, by all means contact NQA. If you need any commercial quotes in terms of allocation of days, etc., then by all means contact us and we can have a quote to you within a few days. So thank you all very much for your attendance. You all should be receiving the presentation, and there is also the recording of the webinar is also recorded and will be available online. Thank you all very much.